welcome to our talk on making games over here, forging a career in games in New York City. I'm joined by three wonderful panelists here. I think we're going to do a quick round of introductions, and I think we'd all be pretty happy if we spent most of this time answering questions from you guys and sort of engaging in healthy debate around the topics that are most interesting to the people in attendance. So without further ado, let's kick things off. Hi, I'm Coray Seifert. I'm the Director of Production at Experiment 7. We make super cool t-shirts, also VR games. And I've been a game developer, a writer, producer, and designer in New York City for about 15 years, with a quick jaunt out to New Jersey. So that's me. Bill, would you like to do this?
Hey, I'm Bill Podergiel, studio manager at Avalanche Studios. We've been in New York making action games for console and PC since 2011. I've been here since then. I'm originally from New York, so I'm thrilled to be back in the city making games here. And just, it's an honor to be with all these other passionate developers and game players.
Hey guys, I'm Caitlin Connor. I'm the narrative producer over at Gameloft. So I lead a team there in writing sort of narrative for all the games out of our company. And as Bill said, I'm also really happy to be here and excited to talk to you all.
Hi, I'm Nick Fortugno. I'm the Chief Creative Officer and co-founder of a company called Playmatics, which has been running in New York for 7 years. I've been a game designer, producer, various non-programming, non-art roles in game design since 1999. And I've run my own company with co-founders since 2008.
Great. So I thought maybe a first good topic to jump into, given the sort of theme of working in New York City and creating a career in New York City, would simply be talking about maybe your first foray into New York City development. What was your sort of first job in the city? Because there's often some weird and lovely anecdotes. Yours is probably a little bit less weird and whatnot, but
I came to Avalanche and been here ever since.
Bill took the only normal route to getting a job in New York City. Usually it involves backflips and the dark alley and a bribe. No, only me. Well, anyway.
So my first job here, I was working as a part-time QA tester at a company called Next Island that was making an MMO. And I got that job because I'd been an intern at another company and sort of had a connection there. And they were like, well, we need somebody, but not full time. Can you come do this like 10 hours a week? So I was doing that. And then from there, worked up to be a production manager. But
what's it called?
Next Island.
Next Island.
It's not very many people played it. So you guys have probably never heard of it. It was run by a company called Mindark. It's based out of like Sweden. So they do a bunch of games with that. Yeah.
That's the weird New York City story we were looking for.
Yeah.
Working on a Swedish MMO.
So I was an English teacher in Bronx Community College, and in my spare time I role played a lot, and so I played D&D and things like that since I was like 6. And I ran this live action role playing game in Vampire the Masquerade called Seasons of Darkness, just for the hell of it, and I ran that thing for 5 years, and during that time a number of people in New York floated through it, and one of them was Eric Zimmerman. Who now teaches at the Game Center, and at the time was running Game Lab, and he saw my work, and he was like, you should be a game designer. And I gave him a quote that existed at the time from Dragon Magazine, that there were more professional astronauts in NASA than there were professional game designers, which was actually true at the time. And so when the LARP ended, he invited me to his house because we were going to work on something together, and he started off super apologetically that like, oh no, I'm really sorry I can't hire you. We don't have any money at the company to hire you. And I suddenly realized he was telling the truth, that he actually wanted to hire me. And I was like, I'm an English teacher. I can't program. I can't draw. I don't know if you want to hire me anyway. Why don't I just intern for you? And then we'll see how it goes. And that's how I got into the game industry.
Nice. That's also sufficiently weird, actually. Yeah, mine is actually less weird, but it was sort of poetic. Like I was graduating college in 2004, and I went to interview for a bunch of jobs, and one of them was on Wall Street doing technical writing, really exciting stuff, and you had to wear a suit every day. And the other one that I got an offer for was from Large Animal Games, and the conversation sort of went like, well, what would you like to do at Large Animal Games? And I said anything. I'll sweep the floors. I'll do anything. I'll test it, whatever. And got both offers, and I remember sitting in the train station sort of thinking, and of course the Wall Street one was heaps of money, and I remember I just sort of had this like moment in time where two shards, just went the other way, and I chose to go to Large Animal, and I think it was the best decision I ever made. I went from intern to associate producer to working on all kinds of weird and wacky stuff over 15 years. So I think I think we've covered some good ground here.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a through thread of like pile of money over here,
Yep.
making games over here.
Yeah, for sure.
I chose making games, and I'm happier for it.
Yep. Are there any burning questions from the audience? We have a bunch of stuff we could talk about, but if you guys have anything, we're all ears.
So I feel like as a indie dev, I've got a million ideas, and ideas are bad enough, but I can put some time in development, and I can, probably take a few years, maybe get a couple of them complete. But, I feel like what I'm really looking for is, like, how do I get help doing this, Like, it's hard working a regular 9 to 6 from Monday to Friday, and you have like 3 hours at night, maybe the weekends, assuming you don't want to be entirely alone all the time. Like, how do you approach this in a reasonable timeline? Or like, can you take an idea somewhere and actually, like, or do you need a beta, or is there any? You just take a beta somewhere, like, hey, can you hire me to make this game for you? It's good. Does that even exist? I assume no. But
That is a great question. So for anyone who's listening on Twitch, the question was, you've got all these great ideas for indie games. How do you turn them into reality with all of the things that being an indie developer entails? Which I think all of us are like, twitching, remembering those days, or those current days for some of us maybe. What do you guys think? I have an answer, but I'm more interested in your answers.
I think a lot of it is just carving out the time. We've got a few people at our studio who are working on a AAA game during the day, and then evenings, weekends, they put in the time. And it is tough. It's difficult. It's, I think, a matter of picking an idea and committing to it and putting the time aside. As my brother-in-law might say, do something. Even if it's wrong, just do something. In response to your question about is there a possibility to get funded by another studio, I haven't heard of that happening, but I don't know if...
Yeah, publishing sucks right now. Like, it really sucks. It used to not suck. It used to actually be okay. Like in the casual days, and people talk about the indie-apocalypse, but the indie-apocalypse is viewed the wrong way. You may have heard this phrase, right? Like there's too many indie developers now, and it's just flooding the market, right? That is not the problem. There are always been a ton of developers. The problem is that the channels and the publishers are not in a business mindset to actually support indie development right now, for a variety of reasons that history tells us are going to end very badly very soon. So the things that you could do, like when I started in like the early 2000s, aren't really possible anymore. Like when I was at Gameloft, which was the first company I worked with, we just got like $300,000 to make a game from a publisher, right, on a napkin. It was like, here's an idea. $300,000, Large Animal got work that way. Like, you could do that. That doesn't really exist the same way anymore for commercial games. It does kind of exist that way a bit for games in education, or games in journalism, or games in healthcare, or in VR right now. You can do a little bit of that still, and I assume in AR and MR you could do a little bit of that. So, like, there's ways you could do it, but if you just have, like, hey, I have this indie title, I want to make the next, Cannibalt or Cave Story or Super Meat Boy or Dysphoria, no. Right, that funding doesn't exist. But I mean, you should be a little sanguine about it in a way, because like we're artists, right? And go talk to some painters about how much money they get to make paintings, and you'll realize that we're not all alone here. I think that trying to get money from the publishing system that exists now won't solve your problem, because you'll have to have the games so finished by the time you go to them that you'll have done all the work anyway. Which is not a reason not to go to them when you have all the work done. They do offer things, but I think you have to think creatively about how to go. The way that I do it as a small business is I pivot towards wherever I think people will pay me that I find interesting, and I work on my IP on the side. And I build those relationships. Because keep in mind, if you're an indie developer, you have a bunch of skills that make you good at game design. And if you're smart about how you do game design, there's ways you can leverage that with people who don't understand game design but are interested in what games can do. And there's a lot of them out there, and I think there's a lot of ways to make that happen.
Yeah, and I guess speaking to finishing something, I think as well, just whatever idea you have, trying to sort of downscope it a little bit, because I think, being that we are artists and very creative people, we tend to get sort of too excited and in love with our own ideas and kind of explode them into these enormous projects. And it really is just about finishing something. So if you can take that idea and you can figure out ways to make it smaller and finish it, I think that's a great, first step.
So I think these are all great points, but I think you guys are all wrong. So what I think you need to do is you need to treat your independent enterprise like a business. And the way places like Activision or EA do it, they don't say, all right, let's go make this game. Here's $40 million. They say like, all right, let's come up with 50 ideas. All right, which of these ideas is the best idea? Now, don't come up with 50 ideas, but find those 3 or 4 ideas that you're really passionate about. See if you can do a prototype in a weekend or a paper prototype, or just explain it to someone, and go and talk to your friends and people you trust, and get that one idea, right, that people are screaming for. It's like, dude, I want that now, right? Take my money, right? And you'll find it, right? You'll throw out a bunch of crappy ideas, and people will be like, oh yeah, that's a really cool idea. You should totally make that. And they're wrong. You shouldn't. It's when you throw out that one idea, like, oh, it's a fidget spinner and you can play games with it. Then people are like, yeah, do that, right? So and then once you find that one idea, do everything they said, because that's the only way to do it, is by carve out time, consider it your enjoyment, your daily passion, right? It's like that's how you breathe, and just finish it, even if it's the wrong thing. But if you can do a couple little tests and test the market with some people who you think might be your consumers, that's like a very good start. Great question, by the way, and I think that's New York of a lot of places, since there aren't 4,000 person companies here. There's a lot of people doing that kind of work, right? Starting off in the indie scene, make a game, either turn that game into a business or get noticed from doing great independent work and get hired by a game dev studio, because I think we've all hired people where you're like, holy crap, you made that by yourself? Come here, work with us. Any other great questions? So I think one of the interesting things about this panel is it's comprised of people in sort of these different interesting slices of development. So I'd sort of like to step through that a little bit and get a quick sort of rundown from you guys on where you think things are. So we'll start over with Nick. I'm totally putting you on the spot here. So Nick exists. Actually, wait. Let's
yeah,
go
exists.
last.
Yes,
this
I
is
do.
The weirdest
This is
corner.
good start.
The best corner, but the weirdest corner. So let's start with Bill, because it's kind of the most normal corner, right? It's easy to understand. It's AAA. So for you and Avalanche and the people making AAA games in New York City, what's that like? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What is it like making AAA games in New York City?
It's I think one of the big challenges is that, unlike being in Los Angeles, Austin, some other gaming hubs, there isn't a big pool of senior AAA talent. So we're doing a lot of recruiting from other cities, from Europe, and so getting people out here can be challenging. They're concerned because we're the only game in town. There's concerns about cost, space, that sort of thing. So recruiting for us is challenging, but it's also kind of a double-edged sword, because a lot of people want to be on the East Coast. They want to be in New York. So when we find people like that, they'll approach us instead and be like, I just want to be in New York. Do you have anything available? We also don't suffer from turnover as much. People going to other studios. It happens. There's other studios in New York, but it's not like in Los Angeles, where people can just fire out a resume, go across the street to another company if they're dissatisfied with where they are.
Yeah, it's true, and I've hired people too, almost not exclusively because, but it's like a really great thing to hear when people are like, I love New York City, I want to stay here. So if you're job hunting in New York City and you love it here and you want to stay here, tell your prospective employer that, because low retention is often a very good thing for studios, especially with senior top-end talent. So that's a good one. So Caitlin, you work in a very interesting sort of like worldwide company with an outpost in New York City. What's that like?
Well, you get really good at working remotely, I would say, with various people, and appreciating sort of building relationships over the long term via email, in the day-to-day, just trying your best to get to know people that you may never see them face-to-face. And so a lot of those relationships are built over Skype, and sort of on every project that we work on, just trying to really get to know the team as best as possible from a remote location, I would say, is our biggest challenge. But it's really rewarding when it works out well, so yeah.
Yeah, Nick, you put that really interesting the other day. It was like reasonable alternative work structures.
yeah. Just
Yeah.
figuring out, like, you know, I mean, I think it's just, that's more kind of a question for me of like what it's like to grow up in the games industry, and like suddenly you have kids and suddenly you want to live in a bigger place, and like you don't necessarily want to be there for 17 hours a day, and like, and if I'm a programmer, commuting kind of sucks. I'd rather just sit in one place and do it. And so figuring out like what makes sense for people to work is sort of like a lot of the, like what you do as a business owner is like if you're going to be a business owner, you're going to hire people, one thing you have to realize is that people are just universally weird. And like even the good people are weird, the bad people are weird, everybody's weird, they all have weird needs. And so part of what you do is navigate weird needs. So when someone needs their desk to be a certain way, or someone needs to have this time on their own and stuff like that, you have to ask yourself, how important is it for you to have control over these people's lives, and how important is it for you to like navigate with them in a way that makes things work. And that's going to be different for different people. I think different people work differently, and managers work differently too. But I find that the best way you can keep people someplace small is you make it a work environment they like, right? You give them a sense of authority over what they do, and you make it a comfortable space for them, and you adapt to what they need. So I have staff with kids, and staff with kids get different kinds of considerations than staff who don't have kids, and I have younger staff and older staff, experienced staff, less experienced staff, and I bend the way I work to make sure all of them feel comfortable.
Yeah, do that. That's important. So Caitlin, follow-up question for you. How do people, you know, in this global organization view New York City? Is it oh, it's New York City, it's the top dog, it's the big city of the world, or is it like, wait, you're in New York City? Like, how do you find that sort of flow?
I think they think it's a very impressive place to live, but I'm not sure if they know like how large the game scene is here. I don't think they really have like an understanding of that necessarily. So it's mostly just viewed as like, oh, I want to go to Times Square. Like you have a lot of conversations about places they'd like to visit in New York City, and you're like, yes, that's great. You should do that when you're here. Like, yeah.
Nice. All right, so Nick, you work in the sort of weird and cool, like social and serious and emerging games space. What's that like, and how does sort of New York City play a part in that?
So New York City kind of has always had one company that does all the weird miscellaneous stuff, right? So the company I started at, Gameloft, was kind of the first of them, and then I got handed to a company called Area Code until Area Code was acquired by Zynga, and then I got handed to a company called Hide and Seek until Hide and Seek went out of business, and then we sort of inherited it. So we do, like when someone in education wants to make a game, when a museum wants to make a game, when like a random scientist wants to make a game, like that's the kind of stuff we do for a living. That's a hustly business, right? Because like there's not like a queue of like, I want to make a weird game somewhere at GDC where you just sort of like walk up to the front of the queue and take all of them at once. But it's neat because you get to work on a whole bunch of weird stuff, right? So in my company's history, I've had games that have run in museums. I've had physical card games been produced. I have games in clinical trials right now to help people with ADHD and with smoking, and I really hope to hear about the ADHD one soon because it's doing really well. I've done history games. I've done, you know, like bizarre little vanity projects for rich people. So like it's a weird assortment of stuff. But it leads you to, you don't have a kind of rhythm of a larger organization behind you that kind of helps you make sense, and you don't have like these sort of pathways. It's much more, like these smaller companies are much more like on the ground meeting people. And being in New York is interesting because New York has a lot of different industries in it. And geographic location matters to business because people, even in this day and age when you're actually making handshakes and sales, people like it when you're sort of nearby. There's a reason why New York City venture capital groups exist, and why New York City venture capital groups exist in the face of like the Sand Hill Road giants. It's because they don't really want to fund people in New York that often. And there are lots of good businesses coming out of New York because there are lots of good universities in New York producing people who can make good businesses. And so there's a whole venture scene around New York. Why do you need that in a global world? Because location actually kind of does matter. It doesn't mean you can't work remotely. I mean, I think you can do tons of that stuff. I know people run wildly successful companies that have been purely remote. But when you're getting business, it's like a useful thing to be able to go to someone's office. It's a useful thing to get coffee with somebody. Networking matters. I mean, I know that's, take a moment, absorb that. I know that was shocking.
Let's put a pin in that one because that's its own question. I think that's a good one to cover next. But that's a great point. So actually, it's funny. VR actually affords you something similar and something awful. The awful part is sometimes you'll punch the person sitting next to you when you have a headset on because the offices are so small. It's happened a couple, like Robo Recall. Whack! It's not good. So physical space with VR, bad. Like the towers will interfere with each other. It's super crappy. But what's great is, one of the challenges in VR and emerging technology is that nobody has the technology, right? No, on a grand scale of things, the investors don't have it, the press doesn't have it. So having one big city where everyone is and they can just swing by your office in 15 minutes, assuming it's not some subway catastrophe, that's powerful, right? And that's something that someone in, Omaha, Nebraska does not have access to. And so I think that's, for the VR corner, that's something that's very interesting about New York City specifically. So we have about 20 minutes left. I think I'd like to cover the networking thing, but before that, I'd like to go see if there's anybody who has any burning questions.
VCs. Okay, so do VCs are VCs in the New York City area who do fund technology funding gaming? Was the question, and the answer is VCs tend not to fund products. VCs see products as risky, right? Because a product is hit driven, so it's sort of like there's sort of an understanding, and this is kind of generally true of understanding entertainment business overall. Is that like you'll hear this thing called portfolio strategies, right? And the idea behind a portfolio strategy is we don't know what's going to work, right? We have some good guesses. If we make a spin-off off The Walking Dead, probably that will succeed. But we're not positive, and if we keep making spin-offs off The Walking Dead, eventually people get bored with zombies, and then we got nothing. So we got to try some new stuff, and some of that stuff's just going to fail, right? And this is understood. Like if you look at a channel strategy in cable, you see this all the time, right? Like HBO will release 6 new shows, right? And they know all 6 of those shows aren't going to succeed, but they don't know which ones are going to succeed. So they make some bets, right? They try some stuff out, and then they see what lands. And some of it is weird and new because they know they have to keep their audience growing. So if VC looks at a game, if you come to them and they say, I have the idea for the greatest game ever, it's going to make millions and millions and millions of dollars, and it's right in the zeitgeist, and you're going to destroy with this thing, they're like, you got like a half a chance of failing, we're not going to fund you. Right? And that's actually not that crazy to think about. That's not really a place where you're going to see money for games. Now, if you have a technology that's involved in games, if you have a portfolio strategy towards games, if you're demonstrating that what you're doing could become a platform, that changes the equation a lot for VCs, because then they're like, oh, well, you're not building up an entertainment property. You're building a sieve for people to get gold with. I don't need to know where the gold is. Everyone's going to use a sieve. So great, we'll fund a sieve. And so that's a lot of the technology that you see get VC funding kind of come at it from that angle.
Yeah, that was actually how we did a bunch of our VC raise was, so Experiment 7 is VC backed and private investor backed. And a large portion of that is the platform play, right? We're making this VR platform that takes care of all the control stuff, all the multiplayer social stuff, and it's cross-platform. And so when we go to a VC, we're not saying, hey, we've got this cool idea for a chess game. We're like, hey, think about all the games you could make and all the third parties we could bring into this ecosystem. And they're much more open to that. I think also, you made a great point once the other day that VCs today in New York City are different than VCs 5 and 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
They're definitely more open to entertainment properties and entertainment platforms, as opposed to like 10 years ago, it's like, are you making healthcare software? Okay, cool, I'm interested. If not, yeah. So it's better to be here than pretty much anywhere except for the Valley for VC, because there's a lot of them here relative to Orlando or some random place. But you got to give them something they want to invest in, as opposed to like 10% hit rate of entertainment products. Great question. Any other questions? Burning a hole in your pockets.
For example, if you create a game and it's not perfect, and you want to do it in the world and get like the architectural results, like what is the best strategy to other people play, and then you collect shape of the community adjust your game for players.
Great question. So the question was, if you have a game that's not perfect, but it's already something together, how do you get some data on it, get some feedback? Steam Early Access is a big one. I think New York City is lucky in that there's a lot of sort of indie arcades and events where you can just bring a game and have people play it and get some at least anecdotal data. What do you guys think? Turn it over to our accomplished panel. If you had a half-done game, I mean, is Steam Early Access still a viable way to do that? It was 5 years ago, but after the sort of flood of games on there where it's hard to get any meaningful number of players, is that still true? He asked the people who don't make Steam Early Access games.
We're all considering, yeah.
It's challenging, and going back to the point about networking, a lot of it is staying engaged with your audience. So it isn't enough just to release a game on early access, for example, and collect data. You have to show that you're committed to the game, and that's having active forums, doing weekly or very frequent, let's just say, updates to the game, and proving that you're improving the game and still committed to it. But yeah, I think it's still a viable strategy. But Steam is a very crowded ecosystem, so it can be very challenging to get traction there.
That's a great point. Also, Discord is a great sort of community building thing where you can have sort of unfettered access in the way that Twitch or Twitter doesn't quite give you. So I would recommend checking that out. So I think, unless, do you guys have a thought on this one?
Well, I was just gonna say, as like an aside to that, also that I think one of the big tricks is not necessarily even so much getting feedback, but sorting through the feedback to understand what will be a valuable change to your product versus something that may seem cool on the surface, but if you throw that into the mix, it's gonna like knock everything out of place. So that's tricky. I don't have a good answer to like how to deal with that. I just think it's interesting.
I'm totally the same way. It's so for me, I have the opposite problem. If I'm working on something and I bring it out too wide, I find myself reacting to all of the feedback as opposed to filtering it perfectly. So I usually bring it to like a sort of trusted group of people who I know are going to give me like good feedback. And then once I've sort of like bulletproofed the concept, then you go a little bit broader. It's not easy, right? That's an art in and of itself. Once you have something, bringing it out to people. Take any thoughts, or you want to go to the next question? All right. Well, why don't we touch on the networking thing? So, New York City, I think everyone in this room gets that networking is important because you've shown up on a blazing hot Saturday to play NYC, which is awesome. But let's talk specific tactics. New York City, what is the best strategy for networking in New York City in today's game industry? I love putting these guys on the spot.
Do you want to start? I guess, like, speaking from my own experience of networking in New York City, I used to come out to Playcrafting events like this back in the day, much more so than I do now. But yeah, just going to events, and I think picking an event, some sort of an ongoing meetup, and going to it consistently. Like, if it's a month-to-month event, try to go every month, because each time you meet people and you shake their hand and you have a conversation, they remember you more than if you just meet them once offhandedly and you never speak again. And sort of don't assume that any connection won't be valuable to you, because you never know what someone is going to end up doing, 2 years down the road. Everybody's valuable in a certain way. So just try to shake as many hands as you can, I guess.
That's a great point, and something that's overlooked. Once you start working in the games industry, you often get hit up by biz dev people to buy something, and it's just nonstop. But if you sort of close that wall off, you're turning off a lot of potential networking leads, where those people might go from business development at like, oh, it's localization services, but only for pagers, right? To like, oh, I'm at EA now and I'm doing business development for EA. Like, you never want to sort of like miss a potential relationship like that. So, good point.
Yeah, so before I answer this question, by show of hands, how many of you feel like you have what you would call a networking strategy to approach the world? Okay. A small number. All right, so I'm gonna give a couple basic things. First of all, networking is about loose ties, not strong ties. This is like the most important thing to understand, right? So if you don't, this is like a term from like networking theory. It's like a strong tie is like a good friend of yours, right? Like maybe, or your brother-in-law or something, right? Like someone who you're deeply connected to, you see all the time. That person will probably do nothing for you. Right? It's not that your brother-in-law sucks. It's that your brother-in-law is a very small number of people, and the chance of your brother-in-law landing something that's going to be useful to you is not that helpful. Loose ties are like your brother-in-law's friend who you met once at a barbecue. Like, that's a loose tie. Those are super useful because they get very, very big. The way you meet loose ties is by meeting everybody and being nice to everybody. You just talk to everybody. You give everybody your card. You be funny, right? It's not that hard. You just like be friendly and nice and mention. I know.
He's full of crap. Being
important.
funny is really
Yeah,
hard.
this is super important because I think that I work with students a lot, and I think sometimes students think networking is like someone in this room has $2 million to fund my game, and I have to like weave through this room, and eventually I'm going to find that person, and they're going to be like, you. Wait, let me get my bag, right? Like that does not happen. What happens is the way I mean, and this is literally, I'm going to give you a literal case of ways I've gotten business in the past. I meet somebody at a conference where I spoke about games and education, and after the conference, someone mentioned that someone they knew had seen the talk, and they wanted to know if I wanted to make a game about this hard thing. I work with somebody who's a producer on something somewhere that goes kind of south, but the producer remembers me as someone good and then moves to another position and contacts me when they need something else. And this is a literally true story, I break my arm, and I'm in the hospital getting x-rayed for a surgery for my arm. And I mentioned to the anesthesiologist that I'm a game designer. And they mentioned that they do game design, they're trying to do game design stuff with their education, so I give them my card.
With your one good arm.
With my one good arm. And then I fall unconscious because I'm being anesthetized. And that is a job I did at my company. Right? Now, did that happen every time I went to the hospital with an injury, which is thankfully not that often? No. Right? Did that happen at every party I went to, at every talk I gave? No, because you don't know. Right? But that's the point of loose ties. You don't know. What you want to do is circulate. And so the second thing I want to suggest is the key thing about sales that works about selling is people buy what they need or what they think they need, right? They don't buy what you sell, right? So if you try to sell them what you sell, it's a really uphill battle because you're kind of praying that this person needs what you're selling, right? What you want to do is figure out what do they need, right? And how can you provide what they need? And that gets back to Coray's point before of like, if you have this one idea, which is like your dream game and you want to make it, that's hard to get people to get on board with unless you really, really have something like that just magically hits the community. It's not even that it's great, because it probably is great. It's that it's great and everybody happens to be interested in it right now. That's a dangerous kind of business to do because it's a lot of chance in that. A better kind of business to do is to have stuff that you can shuffle around a little bit and then find the interesting thing in what they want. Right? And so if you go to not just Playcrafting events, which I think is great because games people hire games people and talk to games people, but find other kinds of things you're interested in or know about, right? There's a lot of like museum conferences. There's a lot of education conferences. There's a lot of healthcare conferences, journalism conferences, new technology conferences, right? And all that stuff is in New York. And there are 2 of the best game universities in the world are in this city right now, right? So if you're looking for talent or you're looking for connections out into the industry, there's like 2 extremely powerful institutions here. So going to events around that, like events like Playcrafting or playtest nights at NYU or speaking events at Parsons.
Come out and play.
Come out and play. Come out and play. Thank you. They're useful ways of sort of making contacts in these weird spaces, and that's how the work lands. It doesn't land reliably, but do it enough and it starts to land. And that's like a way to work. It's not going to make your dream game right now. It might make your dream game later, but it will get you in front of people who could potentially have you do work and get you moving.
Yeah. FYI, Nick is not advocating breaking your arm.
No.
Legal disclaimer.
No. Most of the time I've broken my arm, I did not get work. Like, definitely, we're talking like 1 out of 9, 1 out of 10.
Wow, that's pretty good odds, actually.
It's a small sample set,
Wait, how many
unfortunately.
times have you broken your arm?
Oh, yeah, I'll tell you later. A lot.
Maybe we should talk about how you design games.
You jump out of second-story windows. Isn't that like a critical part?
Like
somewhere, somewhere right before alpha.
Right. I think one other metaphor.
Yes, I'm not advocating people jump out of second-story windows. In case I need to say that.
Just only daydream about it. So I think IGDA. I want to throw IGDA meetings. I want to throw on the top of the stack there. Because I've found a lot of people who go to IGDA meetings are just nice and easy to talk to. And even for people who are like, I've been doing this 15 years and I talk to people all day, it's kind of hard to just walk up to them and be like, hey, I make video games. Do you make video games? Like it's hard, right? And so IGDA meetings are really good for that. Any other topics? Networking? Any other comments?
Totally agree. I think the one other thing I'd add to it is reach out to other developers, especially in the city. we've started meeting with studio heads of other companies here. Make connections at other studios to build up your network that way.
Yeah, that's actually been a really great thing. And one of the things that happens is once you start making games, you don't have as much free time. And so you don't think like, I should go to a bar and drink this beer and talk to someone else about video games. You don't think that. You think like, type. So reaching out to someone who is typing, that can be like a good like, hey, remember, people? You should go hang out with people. And sometimes they'll appreciate that. So don't be afraid to reach out to busy people. All right, so I think we have 5 minutes left. Any other great questions? I think, there we go. Awesome. Right. Great question. So the summation is, free to play, premium, other, right? What's the best way when you're starting an enterprise from the ground up? We'll focus this specifically on New York City. How do you get started? I actually just had a conversation. A couple of buddies are starting a company, and I have a friend at Rovio who's their head of all the analytics stuff. I was like, hey, these guys have this cool idea. What do you think? And he's like, don't worry about these two metrics. Don't worry about monetization, and don't worry about acquisition, right? Don't worry about making money yet, right? Worry about retention, right? Worry about making a game that people will come back and keep playing. And if you do that, whether it's a premium game that people will just love and it reviews extremely well and you'll bring in cash that way, or whether it's a free-to-play game and you put a simple monetization mechanic on top of it, as long as you're not sort of like closing the door on any of those and you have a strong core, that's a good way to get started. That being said, that's a totally abstract answer to a specific situation. So your mileage may vary. And I would be very interested to hear what you guys think about that broad spectrum of ways to make games nowadays. It's a meaty question.
Yeah. I guess Avalanche is a little bit different because we're a bigger company, but we've actually dabbled in some free-to-play through Steam, not mobile. And it's, I think, like Coray was saying, building an experience that people want to come back to is the most important thing. And then figuring out the pricing afterwards is probably a better strategy. One of the things that we do is we've got proprietary technology. We use that in all of our games. And some of those games are big, like Just Cause 3. And then we've got some smaller games like The Hunter. So I think any way that you can perhaps diversify your portfolio by reusing technology, reusing assets, that sort of thing, so that you have a bigger portfolio. And this goes back to the portfolio strategy as well, where you have different touch points for customers or for networking. That can be really powerful.
Yeah, so at Gameloft, we only do mobile freemium, so that's the thing that I'm most experienced with. And I mean, I think the biggest thing is you can go either way, right? Like both of those things can be successful. on mobile in particular, they've just done a lot of studies, and it's shown that like the freemium games just make way more money. As much as many of us kind of are resistant to that model because it's a really specific type of design that impacts like the choices that you can make in your game. I think the biggest thing is, depending on which one you do, to just sort of, like, I would say actually a little bit of the opposite to the Rovio one, is going into it being aware of which monetization model you want to use, because freemium is super specific, and it's really hard to, if you're making a premium product, try to tack on a freemium model onto it, because the design sort of won't embrace it and the product sort of won't come together as a cohesive whole. Versus if you go into it knowing that it's going to be freemium, you can sort of adapt your design to that model and make it fun rather than feel like sort of a forced experience.
Yeah, I mean, all I want to add is that you should ask yourself what you're doing when you're making a game, right? Like, one thing you'd be doing when you're making a game is being an artist, that you have like this vision and you want to make it, and it's the thing you want to make, and that's like a whole different kind of set of concerns. In that case, you're going to swim, if you swim upstream against the ecosystems that currently exist, it doesn't really matter because you're fulfilling your vision. Don't expect to make a lot of money going that way. You might get lucky, but it's a hard row to hoe, right? Otherwise, looking at the way the market works makes sense. And I think freemium, there's lots of different types of freemium games that do lots of different things. And the sort of Farmville model that I think sometimes people have corded in their head of like, I just slam you every 5 seconds with a chance to get money and then I gate you out of the experience, is not actually how a lot of these games work or have to work. And there have been successful experimentations with lots of freemium models. So I think it's a question of like, I totally agree that like you should be thinking about that from day one, because I've tried to do that, and boy does that suck. Like trying to figure out how to take something that was meant to be just consumed all at once and then tease it out in some weird way. But I also think it's a question of like what's your intent as a designer. I just want to say this out loud. I'm talking a lot from a business perspective. I think it's really, really cool if what you want to do is make your little indie game that is exactly your perfect treasure, and you want to just like spend your spare time working on it. That's awesome. Just be realistic. You're working as an artist, right? Which is almost oxymoronic. And like you're gonna fall into the same pit everybody else is. When you decide to do a black box theater show, the chance you're gonna make tons of money off that black box theater show is small, but you get the theater show you want, right? Like that's a reality. Then there's the reality of making a Hollywood movie, in which case you're gonna just dig through mud for 4 years, right? And like your body's gonna be half filled with toxins, but you get to the end with something that was sort of like what you wanted if you were successful, right? And that's a reality. But you made a Hollywood movie, right? Like you got to the other side of that, and like there's different kinds of hustling. And the question of like whether you're okay with eating that mud is one of the questions you have to ask yourself about your intent.
There's also, I think you brought up a good point earlier that sometimes you'll monetize that not through your company making money, but like the three of you guys will talk to Bill in a couple of years and be like, hey, check it out, we made this the game where everything explodes, and you're like, hey, we like things that explode, and now you have jobs, right? Like that's a valid monetization model for an independent enterprise. I'd like to explode that.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you make good explosions, talk to that guy. So I believe we are at the end of our time. Does everyone need to get kicked out? Can we mingle? Great, thanks. And thanks everybody for participating in the first year of Play NYC. It's awesome.